Costin here with my campaign overview guide for Deathmaster Snikch, the most powerful legendary lord for the Skaven and Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal empires. In fact, he was designed to be really powerful because he was designed as a counter to Malice Darkblade, who's an absolute beast in combat. They were released in the same DLC. So Snikch is an incredibly powerful combatant, but he also has some very powerful campaign benefits, and he also starts in Cafe, which is one of the best areas in the entire game. He's got a lot on offer, but as with every other Skaven legendary lord, there's always downsides. If you want to have a mental image of the Skaven, at least in Total War Warhammer 3, think of Pinky and the Brain. This wouldn't necessarily apply in the lore, but in Warhammer 3, absolutely. Like, huge amounts of potential, but generally bumbling fools when controlled by the AI for varying reasons. The Skaven are a race with a lot of pros and a lot of cons. They have the potential to paint the map in a way no one else really can, and they have the potential to get to high-level settlements in a way no one else can, but they also have significant downsides to deal with it. And let's go over some of those downsides. One of the big ones among them is, of course, going to be food. The more food you have, the more benefits you have. If you have negative food, if you're at a low amount of food, then you lose a lot, specifically in the growth department, construction cost, income, post-battle loot, income from raiding. So you really want to keep the food going. You want to have it at least normal levels, if not ideally at a plentiful level of food. But what is food used for? Well, there's certainly some buildings, especially in the Underway, that can have a food upkeep. Armies have a food upkeep, and do settlement buildings. So, and especially settlements and armies will consume a significant amount of food per turn, especially as you grow a larger and larger empire. But there's another way food is used, and that is when we're looking at taking over settlements. Now, this is Kunlan. This is the provincial capital of the province where Snikch starts in. I'm just going to auto-resolve this battle. I'm going to lose 3 units. That's one of the second things that is a major downside with the Skaven. They have powerful armies, really powerful armies, but a lot of their units have low armor. And as a result of that, the auto-resolve will not treat the Skaven kindly, which is a major downside. Which means you're going to have to fight a lot of battles on your own. Like my army here would tear these guys in shreds. It doesn't matter that this is a walled settlement, they would annihilate them. But because I'm just going to auto-resolve here, I'm going to take substantial losses. More than half my entire army for a battle that if I fought manually, I would easily win. If you're going to play a Skaven campaign, you got to get used to the idea that regardless of who you're playing as, you're going to have a lot of battles that you're going to have to fight manually, unless you want to set the battle difficulty to easy. This is, by the way, on very hard. Though you can easily recover even from a disaster like this, though this is not an outcome you would ever want to have in a scenario. So anyway, when we're talking about food, when Skaven take over a settlement or when they win a settlement battle, they have these 4 options: raising it, sacking it, expanding the Under Empire, looting, and occupy it. They can't just occupy a territory. That's not in their DNA. Sacking it, of course, will give them money. Raising it will give them some food. Expanding the Under Empire will just allow them to get leave the settlement under AI control, but it will give you building slots under the settlement, and you can certainly build a massive Under Empire across the entire map, which might be beneficial when we're thinking about income or food, because getting structures for food can be a big issue. But one of the main ways to use food is to use it for the sake of occupying settlements at a high level. So for instance here, I have enough food to occupy Kunlan at tier 4. It's turn 5. And I have a tier 4 settlement over here. This is pretty substantial, as it will allow me to get some fairly significant benefits over here from very, very early on. Of course. So, and so I start construction here. I get expansionist planning. I'm also going to get the rebellion pretty quickly. But that is a substantial amount of food that I just spent. That's going to affect my growth. That's going to affect my control. That's going to affect my construction cost. So I've just spent all my money basically on that. And I'm also going to get the rebellion next turn. That's the downside. On one hand, you can get settlements at very high level. On the other hand, you're the one that's most often than not going to face the largest number of rebellions just because you have such a major diplomatic penalty. Looting and occupying settlements incurs a major control penalty in a region. And if you do it in entire provinces I have just here, then you end up in a major deficiency. Though I'm still certainly earning more money than I'm spending, but as you can see, it's obviously going to affect my strength ranking, the number of units that I've lost and not resolve. And the rebellion is certainly not going to make things easy either. So this is how the Skaven play out. They have pros and cons. When we're talking about their armies, I've mentioned how they tend to do poorly in Out Resolve. What's the benefit of their army rosters, though? Well, they have some of the best range units in the entire game. Though not in the sense of archer units, but specifically when we're thinking Knight Runners, Gutter Runners with slings, these are some of the best infantry or range units in the entire game. Because they can kill entire armies by kiting them to death. This is something Oxyotl can do it, but these Gutter Runners and Knight Runners are available to every Legendary Lord of the Skaven. It's just that Snikch is better suited at using them. Then there's also things like Poisoned Wind Mortars, Plague Claws, etc. So the Skaven do have a great deal of range firepower. And also some melee power, especially with their monstrous units, be it Rat Ogres, Mutant Rat Ogres, Brood Horrors, Hell Pit Abominations. So, as you can see, many of their units are fairly low in the armor department. So they're going to do pretty poorly. Another thing to mention are the gunpowder units, the Jezzails and the Rattling Gunners. Well, here's the thing. Theoretically, these units are really good, right? The Jezzails and Rattling Gunners. The problem is, especially in Warhammer 3, is that gunpowder units suffer significantly when it comes to being able to shoot their weapons. And this especially affects Rattling Gunners at the moment. Though you do have some really good ranged options. The Poison Wind Globadiers, the Poisoned Wind... the Poison Wind Mortars, and then before that, Poison Wind Globadiers. Those are fairly powerful ranged units. You also start as Snikch with one unit of Poisoned Wind Mortars, and these will devastate units that they hit. No joke, Snikch can take the entire province that he starts in from the Savage Orcs he's facing with his starting army. You don't need to build any unit. I just build more units because I could out-resolve then on the highest difficulty, but if you actually fight the battles themselves manually, you will absolutely annihilate your foes. Going back to the food cost, just something to mention. As you grow in territory, the settlement upkeep is going to become such a problem that it's genuinely going to stop your expansion of territory. Now let's talk a bit about the Skaven economy. Skaven don't just have one or two economic buildings, like the vast majority of factions. They have 4 buildings that can generate income. Actually, they have a lot of buildings that can generate income, but predominantly these 4 over here. Or rather, these 3, and then, of course, the arcane generators that go into the Warpstone reactor. And the way it works with Skaven want to control provinces that have a lot of regions, so they can get a lot of those a lot of these buildings in there, and then eventually get a Warpstone reactor to increase the income from all buildings by 50%. So right now, this province is generating 1,000 income. Once I get all the other buildings settled up, once I get to tier 3, we're looking at 3,000 or more income from this particular province. This is just the starting province for Snikch. So it's certainly a really, really good province because it's got 4 regions and it has the gem mine. This will be the economic heart of your empire if you're playing as Snikch. The downside, of course, of this is that Skaven tend to do poorly in provinces that have 2 regions. They don't want those provinces. And another problem that Skaven have, generally speaking, as most factions faced with provinces you don't want, you might give them to an ally. The issue is for Skaven is everyone hates them. It doesn't matter which faction you're talking about. Some factions at best tolerate you, at best, but even then, there is a certain degree of aversion with every single faction that you are going to encounter. For some stronger than others. The Dark Elves, one of the least. Chaos, one of the least. But it's just more like they tolerate you as opposed to just outright hating you. And by tolerate you, I'm always reminded of the fact that Archaon spat in the Horned Rat's face in Age of Sigmar when the Horned Rat wanted to give him his blessings. And that was Archaon's reaction. That's how people view this game. Everyone despises them to a degree or another. No one really likes them, and they don't like each other either all that much. So that's something you're going to have to contend with when you are going to be playing as a Skaven Legendary Lord in general. Now let's talk about Snikch himself. Snikch starts in Singpo. He has an army of greenskins, a small army of savage or greenskins over here. Next to him, and he will end his turn in the region of the Village of the Moon. That means you won't be able to replenish. It means you won't be able to recruit on turn 1. That's fine. You shouldn't go back to your territory after fighting your initial battle. You want to be very aggressive if you are playing as Snikch. So go from battle to battle to battle. The greenskins here will not be able to stop you if you play correctly. And the correct play style is run around with your gutter runners and night runners. Use your poison wind mortars to annihilate the enemy from range. Eventually recruit more gutter runners and night runners. You can recruit night runners from turn 1 because Singpo starts with this special structure, the Den of Dread Deeds. This generates a substantial amount of income, control, growth, food, gives you devious plans, and gives you recruitment of night runners and night runners with slings. Eventually, you will want to get the Hidden Lair and upgrade that all the way to full for the Ashen Sorcerer and, of course, the Assassin at tier 1. But from the very start, you are able to recruit night runners. You also have the ability of getting a Gem Mineshaft, which will further increase your income. You have really good raw income in your starting territory. Though the downside of Singpo is that it's a minor settlement, so it is incredibly vulnerable. Maybe building a garrison building here once it gets to tier 3 would actually be a good idea. You can get rid of it later once you've secured the territory to the south and the west. Your initial campaign plan is to take Kunlan. So rush here, take it in 5 turns very quickly in your campaign. By that point, you will encounter Lokir. You'll also have neighbors of the Celestial Loyalists, Pomei, and of course Miao Ying to the north. Whereas to the south, you will have one of the bigger threats you're going to be dealing with, which is Yao Ming. What do you do once you take Kunlan? Well, the logical next step would be actually to take the Imperial Road, take Wei Jin, spend some food in Wei Jin. Of course, you should spend food in Kunlan. Never spend food on the minor settlements. Spend food on the major settlements, the provincial capitals. Get them to tier 3. I would say tier 3 is probably the good point to go for. Tier 4, not necessary. In a lot of cases, you do have good growth, especially if you can maintain pretty good food. And there are certainly structures that improve that. So I would get both Kunlan and Wei Jin as tier 3. Take Pomei. If you can encounter a cafe and caravan by that point, that would be great. And yeah, take the Lands of Stone and Steel, and then take Nangao. Though, of course, Nangao is not necessarily going to be a great province for you, so you shouldn't really devote too many resources here, and certainly not a lot of food. Be careful in spending your food. As for the Great Bastion, if you could avoid taking it, that would actually be a great solution. but you might have to eliminate the Imperial Wardens, because what tends to happen in a lot of campaigns is that Miao Ying and the Imperial Wardens tend to declare war on you. And then eventually, everyone starts declaring war on you, one after another. Village, Lokir, and Xiaoming. One of the things you should do is try and prevent the war from happening with Lokir. Maybe completely, maybe only for a certain period of time. Maybe help him out in his war against the Dead Flag fleet. That can and earn yourself some points. Maybe give him territories like the Celestial Lake. Because you don't want the Celestial Lake. It would not give you anything. I mean, there's some wine, of course, in the Celestial Monastery. But these two region provinces are not really worth the hassle. So if you can bribe Lokir and make him an ally, and also give him territory that will allow him to expand further westward, that might be a really good campaign plan. You also might, in the long run, take the Nongchang Bazin, give that to Lokir, make an ally out of him. The reason you want to make an ally is not necessarily because you need them, you don't, but it's just to be able to trade some of these territories, some of these provinces that you don't necessarily want to hold, but you do want to take to eliminate the enemies there, the factions there. So taking these two region provinces might be a great plan for you. Hell, if you could, I would even give Nangao to Lokir. But your early game threat is, after you deal with the Savage Orcs, is going to be the Northern Caffeine factions, including the rebels that Miao Ying fights, including Miao Ying as well. And then later on, it's also going to be Xiao Ming. And by that point, by the point you're fighting Xiao Ming, you're also going to likely have to deal with Village one way or another, either via diplomacy or through war. A bit of advice when it comes to the Northern Castaways: don't bother with the Castaways. I would go and set up an underway. Start setting up underways in these territories, and then get the hell out. Fortify the Great Bastion yourself, hold them back, bleed them to death. Eliminate Village, leave the minor Chaos factions over here intact, because they can feed you resources. They can't bypass the wall. They have to attack it. They can't ignore it. And I do believe as Skaven you can fortify the wall. I do absolutely think that's the case, if I remember correctly. It's been a bit since I've played the Snikch campaign, actually, that long. Anyway. An alternative plan, of course, would be to instead take Kunlan and then march south to eliminate Xiao Ming. Xiao Ming is actually a far bigger threat than his sister. The problem for his sister is that his sister tends to end up embroiled in a war in the north against Village and other factions, and as well as a war against Lokir. And that ends up consuming a lot of resources from her, whereas Xiao Ming just doesn't have these kind of natural rivals, because there's no faction to the near him that he's actually hostile with the exception of the ones he starts at war with, of course, which is the Skaven in Zhenwu and the dissenters in Hanyu Port and Zhangyang. But once he deals with them, he's basically got the free hand to expand, and he is going to end up being one of the major threats for you to deal with. But either way, regardless of which path you do decide to take, be it taking over the north then the south, or maybe the south then the north, regardless of what you do decide to do, you want to take control over the entirety of Cathay. Maybe split it with Lokir, maybe wipe it out, dependent on how the diplomacy goes with him. You're likely going to have to spend a lot of money and also trade territories to keep Lokir happy, because he doesn't like you. Which is a bit odd, because if you're playing as Lokir, Snikch can be one of your greatest allies. I'm not joking at all about it. You can generally get alliances with Snikch if you are playing as Lokir fairly easily in the course of a campaign. Now, that's the geographic situation. Let's talk a bit about Snikch. Snikch gets... he doesn't have to worry about clan loyalty on his lord, so he doesn't have to worry about factions at all. And the loyalty mechanic can be a bit annoying to deal with. Though there's also some benefits with the loyalty mechanic, so losing it is not necessarily beneficial in every way, shape, or form, though it's less hassle to deal with. Then his Night Runners and Gut Runners get armor-piercing warp-infused projectiles. What this means is, for a Gut Runner, or for a Night Runner, or Night Runners with slings, the vast majority of the damage they're doing is armor-piercing damage. This is great for Snikch because the enemies he's dealing with, be it Cafe, Warriors of Chaos, Dark Elves potentially, they're all heavily armored. And against unarmored targets like the Savage Orcs that you start a war with, you're just gonna tear them to shreds. It's a bit amusing, actually, taking your starting army and just annihilating the Savage Orcs in a manual battle, whereas if you fight them manually, you take enormous losses. Now, the downside of Snikch is that he does have that massive recruitment cost downside early on, but you can overcome that through Skaven dealings. So these are contracts that you get throughout the course of your campaign with the various clans. The more you do with a particular faction here, the more your reputation will increase. But the contracts tend to also apply a negative impact with other factions. So for instance, you might get a contract to spy on the clan Pestilin. They're not going to like that. Your diplomatic relations are going to suffer. The downsides are not necessarily too substantial. The upsides, however, are. So you can get physical resistance, research rate, armor, melee defense, food, control. And, crucially, when you are at Revered, you start getting rid of those recruitment cost downsides that you start with. Because, basically, the non-Eshin units are things Plague Claws, Plague Monks, Doom Flayers, Warp Lightning Cannons, Doom Wheels, Skaven Weapon Teams, Rat Ogres, Hell Pit Abominations, Clan Rats, and Storm Vermin. I do want to mention that outside of the Plague Claw catapults, which obviously come from Clan Pestilin, none of the units here are really too substantial. Some of the best Skaven units, regardless of Legendary Lord, come from this chain over here, because that will give you Death Runners, Gut Runners, Night Runners, and as well as, of course, the Poison Wind Globadiers and the Mortar units as well. Those are some of the best. Those are some of the best Eshin units. And I believe you can recruit the Poison Wind units for the same cost, because certainly they're not counted here unless you count the weapon teams. And I'm not sure if they are counted or not, but regardless of whether or not they're counted, your mainline infantry are going to be the Night Runners, and then Gut Runners and Death Runners, and that's what you want to use. They're some of the best Skaven units to use for every Legendary Lord, with the exception of Frat and Eke Claw to an extent, but that's a different discussion. Now, for Snikch himself, he gets an ambush success chance, concealment bombs, melee attack for embedded heroes. You could take an entire hero army. Now, Snikch himself is insane in battle. Absolutely insane. He's a guy designed to counter Malice Darkblade. You can bet your ass that he is ridiculous in terms of battle. Though you would generally want to get Infiltrator and then get his special skill line. You get even more ambush success chance, leadership during ambushes, melee attack during ambushes, campaign movement range, concealment bombs. Though this can also be gained on every Master Assassin Lord. So you probably will want to get a lot of these guys as leading your armies. They may want to get some of the other ones as well. There are certainly benefits for diversifying your lore choices, though of course getting those kind of concealment bombs to hide your units can be pretty great. And then yeah, melee defense, physical resistance, minus control in enemy province, and enemy leadership effects. And even more when we're thinking about from the shadows, slippery, tricky, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, Snikch is a monster in battles. He's got some nice campaign effects. He's got the good starting army. The one downside is that Xingpo is just exposed to Xiao Ming, who is going to be coming for you, because he's going to take Hanyu Port, then he's going to take one Zen Wu, and then Shanyang, Taitsu, and then attack you, most likely. while you're likely dealing with the north. You might want to build a second army dedicated just for the defense of St. Po, or go for the south yourself, trade these two cities to Lokir, so Lokir can potentially help you out when dealing with Xiaoming. If you beat Xiaoming, you basically win the campaign. You're free to expand however way you want. What should be your long-term plan? That's the question. Well, because of all the diplomatic benefits you can get through client contracts, as well as some other benefits you can get from Eshin actions, though you will have to send Snikch to increase the number of available schemes. Well, once you do increase the number of available schemes, you can just eliminate a faction leader completely and just plunge them completely into chaos. But what should be your long-term plan? Well, my advice would be to try and confederate the other Skaven factions. The major ones, Fraught, Ikit, all that, for the benefits they can provide. Fraught is the one that's hardest to get to, and not necessarily worth the effort if you're not playing him. So you might want to leave him for last, though he's likely going to be dead by then. I could advise people to play with a mod that gives you defeat a legendary lord, so when Fraught dies, you would get him. Ikit tends to survive a fairly decent length of time. But what are your options to get to the other legendary lords? Well, you can either go via foot to Clan Moors. Clan Moors is pretty vulnerable to Scarbrand, to the dwarves, to Emmerich. You can either go via foot to save Clan Rectus. Oh yes, to save Tretch Craventail. Worthless piece of crap, though he does have a pretty good territory in Crookback Mountain. But you could either go via foot. You certainly can occupy all of the territory. If there's one benefit to Skaven is that they can occupy a vast number of territory, with the major exception of Ulfuan being uninhabitable. You generally want to stay away from Ulfuan. You already have enough downsides when it comes to taking territory because of the food cost. You wouldn't want to go into Ulfuan if you can avoid it. Besides, Ulfuan negates one of the biggest advantages, because you can't use your underway there, if I'm not mistaken. But besides going via foot to save Clan Moors and to save Clan Rectus from their destruction, you also have a sea route over here. Now, this sea lane, specifically, will leave you here. This would allow you to save Clan Pestilent before they get overrun by the insane Lizardmen alliance of the Cult of Sotek, Itza, as well as potentially Hexuatl. I haven't seen a single campaign where Lord Skrolk was able to win that fight. He sometimes gives it a good go. He sometimes survives for a fairly decent length of time, but inevitably he loses. If you can reinforce him quickly enough by taking Afe and then marching armies over here, if you can reinforce him quickly enough, you might be able to confederate with him. Though then you would end up in a war with all of Lustria. Assuming Itza doesn't, for whatever reason, assuming Itza doesn't get overrun by Alberic and Marcus Wolfhard. That can happen. I've seen it occasionally happen, especially Marcus Wolfhard doing pretty well in his campaigns. But more often than not, Skrolk loses, and then Alberic loses, Marcus Wolfhard loses as well. Just a couple of things to consider there. And then once you've taken Lustria, you can then set sail for Sartosa to help Ikit. Ikit's situation is pretty difficult because he's got Belagar, he's got the Wood Elves all gunning for him, and Morgar isn't necessarily a friend. And what tends to happen in a lot of campaigns is that Ikit rarely, if ever, manages to expand beyond a couple of regions of Estalia. And even then, he's kind of screwed because Mogar puts Hearthstone over here, which creates problems for Ikit if any settlement of Estalia does get raised. Just a number of things. I've made a campaign as Ikit work. There is a good campaign plan to make it work, but it basically involves avoiding taking over Estalia. You could rush Mogar, I suppose. Then, of course, you could also go for Araby if you are deciding to do that. But yeah, I would try and confederate both Claw and Skrulk, maybe with some armies. Send some other armies over here to try and reinforce Clan Mors at the very least, maybe Clan Rectus. Though just be aware that Imric is a particularly nasty fight to deal with. He is isolated, but he's very, very powerful on his own in battle. Just on his own, he can deal with entire armies when controlled by the AI. And that's all there is to say. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.